I set up this podcast because I share the same view as Neil. I'd been a Christian for 25 years. 11 years ago, that belief stopped for the same reason as he said. I don't see evidence of there being a God. In fact, I see a world that clearly looks to me exactly what it would like without a caring, loving, almighty God. G'day and welcome to episode 5. An atheist, a believer and a pastor walk into a bar. Not the beginning of a joke, but we do have quite a few laughs on this podcast. Looking forward. My name is Peter Rowe. Once again, we are broadcasting live from Perth, Western Australia. It's 8 p.m. or just after Australian Western Standard Time on Wednesday, the 10th of January, 2024. And I'll say that because you could be watching it live on YouTube or a replay. Either way, it's great to have you tuned in. If you are watching at 8 p.m. on the 10th of January, 2024, you have the opportunity to ask questions or make a comment. Join in. It's all about you. And we're talking about what happens after we die. So I did say an atheist, a believer, and a pastor walk into a bar. I am the atheist, although by default we do have another one with us, the gentleman who was with us last week, Suresh Rajan, of course, a well-known West Aussie, should be referred to, I think, as of tonight, as a Perth-anality. And for those of you listening around the world, that might not make any sense. We are broadcasting from Perth, so Perth-anality. Yeah, probably wasn't working. Welcome, Suresh.
Yeah, good to be here, Pete. Nice to meet Luke as well. So, yeah, lovely to be here.
Indeed, we'll get to him in a second. Richard is one of two believers. He is in Puerto Rico, of all places, and back with us after a well-earned family holiday is Luke Feeney, Bible teacher and sometimes pastor. Welcome, gentlemen. Luke,
great
how
to be
holiday,
here.
mate?
My holiday, it was sensational. Very, very good. A little bit naive, went away with the family, and I've got 4 young kids, under 11, from 2 to 11. And, my wife and I were foolish enough to take some books down to think that we could have a bit of quiet time and maybe even get some reading done. And they didn't see the light of day, let me tell you. But it was still good. It was great, just not relaxing, so to say.
Yeah, you do look ridiculously relaxed. What was that, Suresh?
That is not a holiday. With 4 children, that is not a holiday.
It's pronounced torture, I think, is what we're really doing. Hello. If you have just joined us, do apologise. We did have some technical issues, but it certainly looks like we've got things sorted out now. So let's get into what we're going to talk about tonight. There are over 2 billion Christians in the world. This was a figure around about 2020, so it's a couple of years old, but still relevant. The vast majority of whom believe in heaven and hell. They believe that when you die, your soul goes either to everlasting bliss or torment or purgatory en route. 72% believe in a literal heaven, 58% in a literal hell. Now, the vast majority of believers assume that Jesus himself taught about heaven and hell, but that's not true. Neither Jesus nor the Hebrew Bible he interpreted endorsed the view that departed souls go to paradise or everlasting pain. Unlike most Greeks, ancient Jews traditionally did not believe the soul could exist at all apart from in the body. Is there life after death? Like everything when it comes to God, I found the claims the Christians make often can't be answered, and very little facts, proof, or evidence. So, gentlemen, state your claim. What is it you think of when it comes to life after death? Is it all over Red Rover, or does life continue? And as a Bible teacher, Luke, I wouldn't mind starting with you and finding out your perspective on this claim.
Peter, I was hoping that, seeing as this was the week that Rich was away, and I thought maybe we'll have a light topic that I can kind of coast through. And then I got your text message not too long ago saying, yeah, we're just going to be discussing life after death, heaven and hell, just a couple of light subjects there. And I thought, oh, geez. But important and really, really important conversations to have. You would think it would be clear cut. And if you had have asked me this maybe 2 years ago, my answer would have been very simple, very straightforward. But it's not so much now. I'll start with heaven. I do believe in heaven. I think it's different to how it's often taught, particularly in evangelical churches. That imagery around mansions on gates on streets of gold and things like that. That's not what I'm thinking about when I think about heaven. I think it's much different. And I don't think it's somewhere that we disappear to and escape from the earth to go to. And I agree with what you're saying around how Jesus spoke about heaven. That wasn't the picture that we got. In fact, the picture and the understanding, and I'll be able to elaborate on this later on, but in a nutshell, heaven is something that we had to bring to earth. And ultimately, I believe God will reconcile all to all, and there will be heaven on the earth. It's not something we go to, it's something that is established. And I believe it's something that as human beings, part of what it is to be human is to transform the world around us, and in doing so, bring heaven to earth, right? I know that sounds a bit fluffy, and I'm not going to rely too much on that, but I will be able to elaborate later on. Hell is something that I had always believed in because I didn't think there was another option. I thought it was clear, cut and dry. That's kind of how it was presented. In fact, I'm very surprised by the statistic that you mentioned about only 58% believing in a literal hell, because in my experience, it's been significantly higher than that, at least in the circles that I've rolled in. I don't believe in a literal hell. Certainly not in eternal conscious torment. I believe the idea of eternal conscious torment is actually heretical. I think it's a horrendous doctrine that I'm disgusted is even associated with the name, and it's completely incongruent with a God who is supposedly love, right? So there's the first big red flag. As to reconciling how Jesus and others spoke about this sort of stuff, we can go into that. But safe to say, I don't think there is any scriptural evidence for eternal conscious torment whatsoever. I think there may be some sort of refining, some sort of purifying. And at the end of the day, I would be what you would call a patristic universalist. So I believe at the end of the day, everyone returns to their creator, to God. And what happens after death in that process, I'm not too sure, but I'm certain that there is no hell in that sense of eternal conscious torment. But like I said, I can elaborate on that later on, but I'd be interested to hear what Suresh says as well.
I did hear, just before we move on to Suresh, an interesting, back in the day when I was a born again believer, that hell, if anything, and I'm not suggesting this is in any way, shape, or form true or something I believe in, but it was a good description, is that hell is the only place where God isn't.
I've heard that too. And
Yeah.
Sorry, you go.
No, I was going to say, and that's kind of probably an easier pill to swallow, as it were, that it kind of, again, there's absolutely no evidence for that being true, but it's interesting. But
there's all sorts of gymnastics that we do.
Yes.
Because when we feel, even as human beings, not just as Christians, but psychologically, when we feel that we have to believe something, even if that thing is incongruent, when we're unaware that there is a rich history of alternative views, particularly when we're in an environment that discourages questions or even discussing this sort of stuff, which sadly there are many churches that can be like that, we have to get very clever with how we reconcile something like this. Otherwise, you're left with facing the concept of God doing that as a monster. And even that sounds good. And I've heard that before. And I believed that for a while, that hell is where God isn't. But it's also a theological absurdity, because if God is the creator of all, he's the creator of hell. So he must be in there if such a place exists. There can be no place where God isn't. It's a metaphysical impossibility, and it's nice, easy get out of jail free card to say, oh, well, it's not really God doing that. It's just this thing outside of God that's doing that. But no, there can't be. So whatever hell is, it cannot be eternal conscious torment. And the whole thing's built on crazy assumptions anyway.
I think the whole issue about, and we'll do this maybe at another time, or it may rear its ugly head tonight, and that is, of course, the issue of Satan. But Suresh, where do you? I know you, as a man who understands Hinduism, and that is certainly very much a part of that belief system that we continue on after we die. You personally?
Me personally, I have no belief in any of the concepts of reincarnation and or another life. For me, it's a very practical process of birth and death, and that's the end of anything, any conscious living that we may have. It's interesting though, when you were talking about some of those beliefs, the Christian beliefs, and we often look at Christianity as being almost diametrically different to Islam. And yet some of those concepts that you talked about there, and I was reading earlier today around Islam and reincarnation, and whilst Islam rejects the concept of reincarnation, it does, however, talk in terms of the process, the doomsday comes after death, and people will be judged as to, so that once and for all, you either go to hell or you be unified with God, which comes back to your concept, Peter, where you're talking about hell being the place where God isn't. And that's exactly what Islam's saying, because Islam's saying you're either going to be unified with God in this afterlife that happens, in this doomsday, and you will be unified with God, but it doesn't talk in terms of a reincarnation. Hinduism, on the other hand, talks about Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, and Buddhism all talk about the reincarnation into a higher being from your current life. So, in other words, they believe that once a living being dies, the Atman or the soul is reborn or reincarnated into a different body, depending on the karma from its previous life. So, in other words, if you've got good karma in this life, you've done the right thing by everybody else, your soul will be reborn into something that is better than what you were previously. So you can be a human, a non-human, you can be reborn as an animal, you can be reborn as an insect, depending on what evil or good you had done in that life. And that's a belief system that actually does exist, and a belief system, particularly in Hinduism, that I observed it being played out in one sense that when my dad passed away in 1997, part of the Hindu ritual was that my brother and I, and it's Hinduism is a very, very gender biased religion, as a number of religions are, but the men are the that's right. The men are the people that need to take the ashes of the deceased out into a river that's close to their home and release those ashes. So Dad died in 97. We released part of the ashes into the Swan River here because that was a river that he adored. He used to walk along there every morning. He and Mum would go for walks there every morning. And it was always his desire. And we sought permission from the appropriate authorities, and they said, yeah, there was no issue from that perspective. So on a bitterly cold September day, my brother and I had to get down to our board shorts and walk out into the Swan River, freezing bloody cold, and release part of the ashes there. Now, for the remainder of the next year, up to the anniversary of his death, his ashes, the other two parts of his ashes were kept maintained in the house. And my mum never ever spoke about him, never ever referred to anything that had happened in his life, and nothing at all. It was all very, we would go into the room, the ashes were in one corner near the pictures of the gods, etc. But mum never ever spoke about him. Then we took those last two urns of ashes to India, to three rivers near his home. And we did the same ceremony there. We released his ashes in each of those rivers. And on the release of that very last urn of ash, as we came out of the water, all of a sudden, Mum wanted to talk about him. And she had really come to that view that she had released him to go on his next journey. And so she was okay to now talk about him. And I found that quite fascinating. I watched the change in her psyche, her mood, and everything, because she really believed that I have allowed him to go on his next journey. And his next journey is in a higher form because he was a very good man. And that was all that gave her the solace and the comfort. He was not dead. He was there on his next journey. And she would one day join him.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? I mean, it really is. When you compare Western deaths and funerals and how there's such a mournful. We were invited a few years, probably about 8 or 9 years ago, when Lou and I went to Bali, and we were friends with one of the drivers over there, and we still remain friends with him. And he invited us to a funeral of someone in his village. He was up around Ubud. And we went to this thing in this great big park, and it was just incredible. I've never seen such celebration of life. I'd only ever seen the devastation and the nothing good comes of a Western type funeral and death. And it was amazing. The great big structure of wood and materials that were able to burn to get rid of the body, and they had all the gas going into it, so it got to the right temperature. They actually would have ashes at the end, because if you just burn a body, of course, it doesn't get hot enough to burn the bones through. Now, it was such a privilege to be there. It was absolutely, I won't say beautiful, that's probably maybe disrespectful to it, but it was so respectful and so different than anything I had experienced. And that sounds a lot what you're talking about. And I don't know whether I know there are Hindus in Bali. I don't know who they were. I don't know what their belief system was, but it was just a complete contrast to everything I'd ever experienced with the death of someone.
And it's an interesting thing I do a lot of advocacy in the space of suicide here in WA and in Australia generally. So I've given a number of pieces of evidence to the Senate standing committees on suicide prevention and so on. And one of the things that I've noticed in the statistics that we maintain is that there is a higher level of suicide amongst Indian and Chinese communities. Why? And you think about that, the reality is that imagine you are one of 1.2 billion people on a landmass. You don't matter. You're not important. But the other part of it is that death is not the end, because there's a reincarnation. So the value of life is nowhere nearly as significant as it is in our culture, in Western culture. But in our cultures, in the Eastern religious cultures, there's a sense that it doesn't end on the day that you're cremated or you're buried, because there is another life. So what does it matter if you were to take your life at this time, because you will come back in a higher or lower form anyway? So it's quite it really provides a different perspective on, what do we do about suicide prevention? Well, we start talking about the fact that this is the end. You're living in a Western culture. This is there is no other afterlife and so on. So it's a challenge. It's a very, very interesting challenge.
It is, because it's such a final thing. That's why it's just so unbelievably painful when young kids find that the only solution is to die. I mean, we all know what that's like, and we've all had friends and people and family that have gone through that. It is devastating. It's very interesting that you say that it does have a slightly different perspective if you think that this is not the end. People still being left behind, of course, and it's still devastating for a family. But yeah, interesting, Luke. Do you experience that in your life often or rarely?
In terms of suicide or yeah, I have been touched by it in terms of being close and with people who have had young kids commit suicide in this, and I still struggle trying to get my head around that. This split decision that has everlasting effects, and we're talking kids don't think through things, and kids are dealing with emotions and stuff, and it's just it's the worst possible outcome for that to happen. And it's interesting. I've never thought of it being linked to those who believe obviously in reincarnation, that death is not the end. And that's quite an interesting statistic, and very sad, because like you said, even if that's the case, and even if reincarnation were true, and I think that's one thing that both Hindus and Christians certainly agree on, is the fact that death is not the end. Now, Christians don't believe in reincarnation, but they certainly believe that once you pass, that there is something more, there is something else. And sadly, there's been a stigma around suicide in Christian circles that has been incredibly harmful. This harmful doctrine that has zero scriptural basis, that says, well, you don't go to heaven if you commit suicide because you're taking a life, and all that sort of stuff, which is absolute rubbish and has caused immeasurable harm in families of faith who are dealing with suicides and things like that, and trying to reconcile that. So that's devastating. But for me, I think this idea that death is not the end is not supposed to create it's not supposed to instill in someone who believes that this life doesn't matter. And I think that's a really important thing. And you see that in the Christian faith quite a lot, with certain escapist theologies, of which heaven can certainly become one. It's this sense of the whole point of life is to one day die and go up to the sky somewhere and be with God, right? And you go, but what? How does that? What is that about? Why would that be the whole point? And then you live your life like that. Now, the extreme case is obviously suicide, but most people don't do that. They just instead live their lives waiting to one day go to heaven, because and not caring about things like the environment, not caring about actual matters of the world, because one day God's going to sort it all out and I don't have to deal with it. And all I'm worried about is getting people to say a prayer so they can go up and live in a mansion on a golden street. And it's completely twisted, because when the Bible and when Jesus talks about heaven, their understanding of heaven was in most cases a very poetic way of describing the reign of God on earth, as in where there is peace, where there is justice, where there is no more oppressed, where systems of hierarchy and oppression are no more. All of this sort of stuff. They're saying when that happens, that is the kingdom, that is heaven, that's heaven on earth. So it was a way of describing how to live your life oriented towards making the world around us like that, rather than trying to escape to someplace up in the sky, but
Oh.
it's been twisted.
Yes. I'm fascinated by that. Look, I love the, what you're talking about is then your goal is to make this exactly what God envisaged, which is a peaceful, okay.
And that's
Yep.
when we see Jesus say things like, the kingdom of heaven is here, or the kingdom of heaven is in you, things like that. And you go, what are you talking about? That's not someplace away from there. He's saying, no. I know you live in Rome. I know that Caesar is in control. I know that we've been under empire after empire, the Greeks, the Persians, like it's been, I get all that. I see on the surface that it looks like Caesar is in charge, but you don't have to live the way of the empire. You can live a way of transformative love. And that is bringing heaven here, because that will overcome the empire. Mercy conquers judgment. It's power under, not power over. It was a radical way of living, which is why he was killed. Religious teachers don't get crucified. Political enemies get crucified. It was the message he was talking was very subversive. And I think that's what's been lost in this idea of escaping one day. I think Jesus would be almost mortified at that idea.
I don't know if there's any questions that have come through and whether you're able to see them on screen. Luke, if you are watching at home on YouTube, a part of the way we've set this up, of course, is that you can be involved and ask questions and tell me what you really think, or tell us, or if you want to, make a comment or whatever. Nothing there?
We do, yeah. We've got some questions here from Fenton Mully. He says, there's a few here. First one, I'd love to hear how help believers address the trauma children experience, fearing hell. That's a very good one. He says, hell fear, or they say, hell fear may prevent suicide, but original sin causes more. There's nothing to do in heaven but be a slave. If free will was possible there, then why did Yahweh require the soul building process?
Are these all different people, or is this the same person?
The same one.
And that's Fenton, is it?
Fenton, yeah, Fenton Mully. So I think the main one there is around, how hell believers address the trauma children experience, fearing hell.
Well, thankfully, there's zero evidence, of course, that hell even exists. It's just a concept and a principle that someone, I think the Catholics have a lot to blame for that, the reward and the fear kind of doctrine that they, ram down people's throats for a very long time. And I think there's the aftermath of that is, again, total confusion. And, as we talk about belief and God and stuff, what I find ongoing, I'm sure Suresh feels it as well, that every time we go down a path, there's always the same ending. It's all just hope and wanting to believe that there's a wonderful place called heaven, because everyone wants to go and see the Auntie Stella and all of the people that have died. And I mean, I think it's a classic wanting to believe in belief. And you said, Luke, yourself, that you believe that there is a heaven. I don't know if that you think that means that there are all relatives of every person that's ever died is there, or whether it's just a place that you go to be with God. But the world from the beginning has never been the world ever that we know of, ever been the world where there's peace on earth. If it came from something like that, like if once upon a time it was just, liken it to the Garden of Eden, and that was the earth, and we could experience that and go, well, we could get back to that. But the problem is that it's never been like that, right from day one, even biblically with Cain and Abel. I mean, straight away they're into it. So the earth has never been how everyone wants it to be, and as a species of people trying to find their way on an angry planet that is hot and cold and terrifying, and I can't believe people still hang on to that, believing that it could be that way, and that God would say, the life on earth is going to be miserable as all get out. until I come back and make it all nice. I mean, wow. I mean, if you believe that, you might as well believe Scientology.
Well, yeah, I mean, it requires a radical imagination, and a
It
crazy
does very.
and a crazy hope and a crazy faith. Um, I agree, and I think that's why empire has prevailed time and time again. Violence has always been the way of humanity, and that's, I think, the radical message for me. That's what I take, is that radical message of Jesus, and not just Jesus. Clearly, there are others who advocate for non-violence, but to come in and say that the way the world can be is peace, and that the way that it is achieved is not the Pax Romana, the peace of the Roman Empire, where you achieve peace by being the most powerful and conquering all your enemies so that they don't say boo. That's not peace, you know. True peace being having all the power in the world and laying it down. And I see that on the cross. That's where I think it's that upside down nature of it. And I fully appreciate and get that sense of, it's absurd. It's never been the case. To imagine a world where there is true peace, where there is no violence, it seems impossible, and it does. But there have been many things in the world that have seemed impossible. You know, the civil rights campaign seemed impossible until there, and there's a long way to go there, but it's getting better. You know, and the patriarchy and women being viewed as equal, that for a long time was not the case, and would have seemed impossible, and yet is now. Again, still ways to go, but there's been a lot over the course of history that seemed impossible, but actually has improved and gotten better. And I believe that, I just think I can't imagine living another way where, if I didn't think it was possible, well, you'd just go the way of the empire. You just kind of go, okay, the point is then to dominate and to conquer and to just get mine, rather than to try and serve and love and speak truth to power. I just don't think anyone would ever speak truth to power if it seemed obvious that it could change. You almost have to have a bit of a radical faith that one day it will. Otherwise, it feels like nothing matters. You know, that it takes an imagination, and the church has had a significant lack of imagination from some of these harmful theologies. But I think it needs to be re-engaged, because it's people with the imaginations that change the world for the better.
I only think religion exists in the first place because of imagination, because it has to be. You use the word faith, use the word imagination. You have to have one of those, because there's no evidence that anything that we're talking about actually has ever existed or will exist. That's imagination personified, isn't it? You have to have a crazy imagination. And again, I go back to the Scientology. No right-minded, logical person is going to look at that and go, yep, I'll buy that. Absolutely. L. Ron Hubbard, not a problem at all. You know, it's like you have to have an incredible imagination to believe that, and to acknowledge that this is a real religion or cult or whatever you want to call it. I think imagination just is hand in hand with religion, because without imagination, you couldn't possibly believe it. I'll just, before we move on, is there one question out of Fenton Mully's list that we could address? Because he has made the effort to write all of this stuff down. It'd be remiss of us not to try and help him out understanding what it is that we're about. Are they questions, or are they more comments about how he feels?
The first one, I think, was a question around how believers address the trauma children experience, fearing hell.
I don't know how you answer that.
And he's commented again saying religion, or they have commented, sorry, Fenton, religion is an incredibly effective tool for tribalism, which I agree wholeheartedly with.
How I'm looking at that one, I'm a bit confused about.
Yeah, I need to think that one through. Just run that by me again. Look, what was it?
The first question, or the
the tribalism.
He said religion is an incredibly effective tool for tribalism.
So
I'm not sure how it's a tool.
Yeah.
Well, I think religion certainly can be used in a capacity to control a group of people. Without a doubt, we've seen that. That's not to say all religions do that, and I don't think religions are created for that, but they can be corrupted by that because they can form an incredible sense of us versus them, of tribalism.
When you think about that, the take for example Islam as a very, very broad base there. The reality is that here in Western Australia alone, underlying Islam are 52 ethnically diverse groups. Yet they've all been brought together under that banner of that Islamic faith, the Muslims, and so on. So yeah, but whether the religion is the tool for tribalism or I'd have to think that through again. Like you, Pete, I'm just trying to work that through. But you're right there, Luke, when you talk in terms of yes, we can bring together diverse communities under the one banner of that particular religion, and that's what's it's quite fascinating.
But Fenton, thank you so much for taking the time to make some comments. If you've got any more, please let us know. It does seem that you're probably on the side of atheism, or maybe you're agnostic. I don't know. They're interesting questions, but please feel free to keep. And same with everyone out there who's watching YouTube at the moment. Love to hear from you if you've got a question. We all have our stories. Maybe you want to know a bit about that, or just whether you are stuck on a particular aspect of faith, and you want to ask a curly one. Give it a bash and see how we go. Can we just touch on Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, for a moment, about the whole purgatory? And there was Stephen Fry talked about this, an incredible part of the journey as a Catholic, which the then Pope about 5 or 6 years ago decided that this doctrine that had been a part of the Catholic Church forever and a day, he just took it away. It's gone. We don't believe that anymore. Does that ring a bell with what it actually was that they were talking about? There was something. It wasn't purgatory because they still stand by that, I believe, but it was something. I think something to do with children, where they go not when they die, but when I can't remember. I probably shouldn't have gone down the path, but I was hoping.
I think I do know. I think it was the practice. The name escapes me, but I think it was the practice of being able to purchase the salvation of family members. So family members that may be in purgatory, if you were to pay the church a certain amount of money, then the Pope makes a phone call, and Uncle John gets to fly up into heaven, something like that. Which clearly was about lining the church's pockets more than it was about anything actually theological. So I'm glad that at some point they did get rid of that.
I mean, they didn't become the richest organisation, for want of another word, by not doing things like that, which were very untoward and relatively evil, I would have thought. But yes, thankfully they did fix one. I think they've probably got a hell of a lot to go. But life after death, according to the Catholic Church. Suresh, what do you know? You have much involvement with Catholicism?
Not a great deal, other than my schooling was always at Anglican and Catholic schools around the world. So in Singapore, not so much in Singapore, but in Brunei, in India, and here I pretty much went to Catholic and Anglican schools and learned a little bit, and it's still the source of much amusement to my children that in boarding school in India, in the Anglican school that we were in, if ever the teachers were unable to come to church services in the evening, it was up to one of us as prefects to conduct the services.
Oh, gosh. What could go wrong?
Absolutely. Can you imagine someone like myself? I've conducted services.
I'd like to be in that service, Suresh.
Same. I want to hear one now. Let's go.
It's the source of much amusement to my kids that and the only reason we volunteered at any stage to do that was it did give us access to the chapel wine.
Non-alcoholic, I'm assuming.
Yeah, well, look, I think in India it probably was alcoholic.
Okay, wow. Well, my kids both went to Catholic school. They went to Arranmore, Ali and Tom, and they managed to come out fairly well unscathed because they had the strength of character to understand that it was there for educational purposes, not for for religious studies per se. So,
Pete, these are your kids that went to Arranmore?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh yes, well, my boys went to Arranmore, and I was actually on the board of Arranmore. Yeah, right up until last year when my second son finished, and it's always been the source of great amusement to both them and to the to my boys and to the rest of the board that we would always start the board meetings with a prayer, except for one little corner of the board where I was completely quiet, not taking.
I've got to digress and tell you a funny story, which I know you both will love it, and you're listening it at home or whatever. Because my son and daughter went to Arranmore, and at the time, I was teaching guitar and songwriting to the displaced Aboriginals in Unit 1 Casuarina.
Right.
With all of the deaths in custody, they were trying to implement different things to keep people, the Aboriginal guys who had come from, back and beyond, from Warburton and up north. And so I was the first person to do that. So that's where I was working a couple of times a week. And Lou, of course, was with Corrective Services back then. So she was visiting the prisons and around the metro area. And Tom was unwell at school at Arranmore, and the lovely lady there said, that's fine, we'll get you organised to go home, and if you don't feel good. And he said, can we call your dad? And Tom, being Tom the rat bag, said, oh, I can't call Dad, he's in prison. And this woman looked mortified, and but that's okay, look, that's fine, everyone's got a story. What about Mum? Oh, Mum's in banding up today, which was true. And this woman just lost, going, oh my God, what are we going to do? And he had they're both working in prison today. They don't have mobile phones. We can't call them. And when he told us that story, he got home. It was the funniest thing ever.
But can I tell you a similar sort of story? It sounds like your kids were good influences on my children, because Rahul, the younger lad, was I think it was in about year 8 or so, and I was the CEO of Epilepsy WA, and advocating very, very strongly for the use of medical marijuana in the treatment of epilepsy. And of course, they're going through a discussion in the classroom around drugs and society. And Rahul's got his hand up. And of course, I could just picture what was going to happen. But sure enough, it did. And the teacher looks around and says, yes, Rahul, my dad says that marijuana is really helpful in the treatment of epilepsy. It was not a good thing at all. So, and years later, he then questioned his religious education teacher as to why he could not join me in the advocacy I was doing around same-sex marriages.
Right.
I suspect you
Good on him.
probably learned a thing or two from your Tom.
Yes, I have no doubt. I have no doubt about that. Well, so Luke, I want to backpedal a little bit to you because out of the three of us, you're obviously the one that believes in a literal heaven, which I was quite shocked to hear you say that. I thought that that wouldn't be something that you would believe in. So, can you just unpack it a little bit more about what it actually means? Like, do you see heaven as being? I'm not ascending to heaven, but rather when in the belief that Jesus returns and turns the earth into heaven as we would all see it. Is that pretty much how you see it? And if so, what happens to all of the people? Do you believe that Jesus comes back and picks all of the goodies and the baddies go elsewhere? I mean, what's the deal?
Can I
No.
add one more? Can I add one more little bit to that question there, Pete? Can you just educate me a little bit on the whole concept of purgatory? I just find this concept of purgatory as some kind of halfway house,
Yes.
for the ones coming out of prison or whatever. I don't quite understand what that's about.
Yeah. Look, I'll start with that one.
Yeah.
And I don't have it's been a long time because I went to Catholic school as well. And so it's been a while since I've delved into their doctrines and the theology around that. But my understanding is purgatory is the place where you're not quite bad enough
Right.
to go to hell, but you're not quite good enough to go straight to heaven either. So I don't know if it's viewed as almost a sorting house, where you could go either way, or whether it's like a holding cell where you have to either jump through enough hoops, have enough people praying for you,
Enough money.
have enough money, be advocated for enough. And if there are any Catholics out there listening, and if I am butchering this, I sincerely apologize. So it comes with an asterisk. Okay, this is not definitive, but that is my understanding. I'm sure it's much more elegant than that when it's phrased in the the catechisms and whatnot. But I understand that's the basis of it, which is interesting. I mean, there's no real scriptural basis for that. I mean, like a lot of these doctrines, there's typically a couple of verses here or there that then you build out on something that makes sense to you, which the brain does, right? We get disparate bits of information and we fill in the gaps to things that make sense to us. We do that every day in 100 different ways with our brain. When it comes to religious doctrine, that then becomes the word of God. That's when it can become damaging, right? Because it's not someone trying to make sense of something. It becomes canon, for want of a better word. But yeah, that's my understanding around that. It is interesting though, because I think the idea of purgatory, whilst I don't believe in it from that perspective, as in you either go down here, you go down there, it does tie in a little bit to my thoughts around heaven. And I must admit, I can't articulate it very well, mostly because I haven't thought about it a great deal. I think about theology and God and all of this sort of stuff almost constantly. It's borderline obsessive, if you ask my wife. It's just how I'm wired. I love it. I love wrestling with this stuff. I love asking questions and trying to think stuff through. But it usually starts for me with the things that I think are important. And I've just never been one of these people that is just hanging out to go to heaven, right? It was always kind of like, oh, that's cool. That's a bonus. But it was never the point of it for me. So I haven't given much thought as to what it would look like. I'm a believer in, like I said at the start, I would classify myself as a patristic universalist, which means it's patristic because I guess it's the school of thought of a lot of the early church fathers, which is something that a lot of us don't realize. We tend to hear the word universalism in the sense that I believe God wants all to be saved, right? To be reconciled to himself. And I believe that if God wants that, then that will happen. But God's not going to force that. He doesn't do it through coercive means. But I also don't believe that people have this tiny blip of a life to try to be born in the right place, believe the right things, be in the right denomination, be in the right church in that denomination, to believe the right theology, to actually be saved and and go to heaven, and everyone else misses out, right? I can't imagine that. There is no time limit on this. There is, that's my belief, is all will be reunited with God after death. And as to what that looks like, I know, I believe in the end of time, call it the second coming, like when God, I believe God will return. And what that then looks like is not all of us sitting around singing hymns of praise to God, because that sounds pretty boring, if you ask me. Even if he is worthy of praise and all that sort of stuff, I think it's got to be more than that. I think it's that we've all experienced those moments where it feels like everything is as it's meant to be. Maybe it's in the midst of a reconciliation with a loved one, or like a long running challenge or difficulty has been overcome with someone, and there is love, or there is a moment of peace. And it's like, it might be for a glimpse, but it just feels like this is what's supposed to be. And I believe it'll be that constantly. There will be no such thing as racism. There will be no such thing as power, oppression, hierarchy. It will just be love. And, I believe people you'll work, but you're not working for money or capitalism. You're working like to take care of this beautiful planet that we've been given. I think it's going to be something totally different. There is no such thing as war. There will be no such thing as, basically Jesus wrapped it up when he says that he came to liberate the captive, to build up the brokenhearted, heal the sick, all that sort of stuff. That's like a picture of what it will look like at the end. There will be no such thing as sickness, as tears, as pain, as heartbreak. There will just be love and unity. And again, it sounds impossible to understand all that, but that's what I believe it will be one day in the end.
Why is it not like that now? Like, let's say, for instance, realistically, that's not going to happen in your lifetime. I mean, people have been waiting for that for forever and a day. What happens to you at the end when you didn't see Jesus come back, didn't happen, and you pass away? What happens to you when this happens when after you've died?
See, because I believe that, and because I believe that death isn't the end, I believe there is life beyond this, then I believe there is somewhere. I don't believe it's a place up in the sky that I go to float around on clouds, but I believe there will be some type of existence with God. And I believe everyone will be there. What's that?
Purgatory.
Look, purgatory, heaven, whatever it is, I think there will be some sort of place like that. And then, but we will all end up with God on earth. And I know logistically and scientifically and all that sort of stuff, it doesn't make sense. But I also know that to be returned to God, to be reconciled, to be in God's presence, means that it isn't the end if I was to pass away. I don't really care as much what that looks like. But I do believe that there will be some sort of place. But I think at the end of the day, the waiting part is probably damaging. I think for me, it's important that I live my life rather than waiting to one day go, or trying to believe the right stuff, or say the right prayers, or do whatever I need to do in order to get to some place away. I'd rather go about trying to, as unlikely as it is, do any work possible that I can to bring about that. See, I think that's where we get the second coming of Jesus wrong. It's not about waiting for God to swoop down, like in some of the imagery in Revelation, which is a totally misunderstood book, by the way. But it's a bit of a side thing. This idea of God coming in to swoop in and make everything right. I think we are the ones that will bring that about through this crazy belief, this crazy imagination that it is possible, that, you know, that we can make that a reality, that we can do anything that's within our power to love one another. Yeah, and it starts within, right? It starts with eradicating racism, eradicating these sort of things that are clearly the kingdom of empire, not the kingdom of God, within yourself, and then working outwards from that. And if enough people do that, it starts to catch on. And I think that's that radically subversive nature of what the kingdom of God is. It doesn't dominate, but it permeates.
So you weren't here last week, obviously. We talked about geographical convenience and the statement that I made was that the very first thing you have to decide when you decide to believe in a God is that the country that you have been born in and your parents' chosen religion, we talked about, India, Delhi, and Hinduism. And how does that, it's hard trying to put the question together. So if the very first thing you need to do is look around and either decide to choose the religion that your parents chose or something different, how does that fit in with your idea about, the love and caring for one another and stuff, if it's only at the moment geographically convenient for you to think that way? Like if you're another religion somewhere else in the world, you're not going to think that way. So are we to believe that people who only believe in the Christian Bible are those that are capable of making heaven on earth a reality? What about everyone else around the world who doesn't share your view?
No, not at all.
How does that work? I can't see how you can make that happen, because you're not unified. It's the most tangled situation in the world, with all of the hundreds and thousands of different religions and gods and ideas, and everyone with their belief that they're right.
Oh, totally.
Bible's not right. The Quran is right.
And that's where, if we make it about belief and believing the right thing, I don't think believing the right thing is what transforms the world. It's this action. And I guess for me, being a universalist, I'm not as hung up on, I believe that God will reconcile all to him, not just the Christians. And look, Gandhi, you did some really nice things. I'm a fan of your work, but you didn't believe the right stuff. It's unfortunate. I would have loved to have had you up here, but I'm sorry, or the, what about all the Jews in the concentration camps that, it's like what you've had to go through is horrific, and they've been mass murdered and exterminated. And it's like, I'm so sorry, but none of you guys get to come into heaven because you didn't believe the same stuff, Or what about, and I used to challenge my students when I was teaching some biblical lectures and that. I would say, if you have two women, right? One is a woman lives in the deep south of America, intrinsically racist, was, raised that way, still very much racist, has said the prayer, believes the right stuff, Bible believing, is at church every Sunday, but lives her life in a way that, is absolutely horrific to certain people purely because of the color of their skin, right? And then you have a woman who is a Muslim, and she's born on the border of two war-torn countries where there's sex slaves, sex trafficking, and things like that. And what she does is she works to actually hide girls who have escaped sex trafficking and gets them to safely across the border at incredible risk to herself. And I said, now imagine Christian missionaries have come through there and they've done the cell. And she said, no, thanks. I'm not interested. I hear what you're saying, but I'm all good. So she's actively rejected the gospel. And she continues to do this work, right? And she saves hundreds of people's, girls' lives. You're telling me that if they both pass away, this woman who just turns up to church every Sunday and happens to believe what you think is the right stuff goes to heaven, and God sends this other woman to hell, right? I said, that cannot work if God is love. That is a totally incomprehensible to me, as is Gandhi, as is all of there's infinite examples, right, where it just does not work. And the early church knew this. For the first 300 years or so, the biggest school of thought around this, with all of the early church fathers, many of the early church fathers, who actually were the fathers of orthodoxy, the ones whose writings and things were kind of what built the church early on, was universalism, was that when scripture says all will be drawn to God, God will reconcile all in all, it means it, right? It's only later on down the track that things got a bit distorted. So for me, that's how I guess I get around the geographical thing, because I think I can't imagine a God sending someone to hell because they were born in another country where it was predominantly Hindu or Muslim. My sister is Balinese Hindu. Like, she married a Balinese man who is Hindu, and so yeah, my sister, my brother-in-law, my niece and nephews, they're all Hindu. We've had many great discussions around this, and I guess to answer the other part of your question around I think there are many people in other faiths who are doing this sort of stuff, who are I mean, Gandhi is a great example, but he's just the most well known. There are people who we will never know the names of, who are Islamic, who are Hindu, who are Buddhist, who have all sorts of different things, and are doing this exact work. It's not a Christian distinctive to do this.
But if that's the case, then why don't you become a Hindu? Why is Christianity your religion of choice? If the end result is the same for everyone on earth, then what difference does it make who you choose? What difference does it make if you're not with anyone at all? You might as well just be who you are and not worry about church or the Bible and all of that stuff, because the end result's the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can make that argument, and that's yeah. And
Might not be a very good one, but it's
no, I hear it. I mean, I personally believe that Jesus was real. I believe he did die, and and all the historical evidence backs all that up. I believe he was resurrected, and therefore, I believe the Gospels, and the more I've learned about who Jesus was, the actual agenda, this radical new different way of life, in stark contrast. He turned people's idea of who God was on his head. God was not this violent warrior God who was coming to just destroy the Romans and elevate them in charge. And it was like, no, he's not a lion. He's actually a lamb. He chooses to lay down all of the power and go to the cross rather than exert that over those who he was trying to save, even those who were crucifying him. There's something incredibly beautiful and subversive, and I'm captivated by that story. And I guess that is why I'm a Christian. I love Jesus. I love that story, and I believe in it.
Look, it's a great story. There's no question about it, and it's not a coincidence that it's a great story. I find the statement, I love Jesus, an impossibility, because all you're doing is loving an idea and a concept. You don't generally love someone who you've never met or have been to some degree real. But to say historical fact that Jesus was resurrected, I mean, that's a big call, Luke. I'd have to challenge you on that, because I've studied it a lot and I can see no concrete evidence for the resurrection whatsoever.
No, what I said was that there's historical evidence that he existed as a person. So he was not.
Oh, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's enough evidence to prove that he was real. But I don't see any evidence for the resurrection. And if there's no evidence for the resurrection, then there's no religion. There's no Son of God, surely.
There is a lot for me. What got me over the line in terms of evidence for a resurrection. And you're right, there's no video footage of a resurrection. But in terms of what is even atheist scholars indisputable is that his followers believed he was resurrected to the point where they were all martyred. So they went from people who deserted him on the cross, didn't want to be known, didn't want to be associated with him over fear of what might happen. And let's face it, even throughout the years where they were traveling with Jesus and doing ministry with him, they were hardly the best and brightest bunch. It was just like, it's almost comical, a lot of the stories around how they were. And yet something happened, which I believe is the resurrection, for them to suddenly completely shift and transform. If the resurrection wasn't true, something happened, and they certainly believed it. People could say, well, it could have been a hoax. Well, I don't see any reason or benefit for it to be a hoax, because they didn't see any benefit from it being hoax. There was no money. There was no material gain or benefit for them to suddenly do that. In fact, it was the opposite. There was only downside for them to proclaim that Jesus was Lord instead of Caesar, to the point where they were all martyred. And yet somehow the death of this no-name local carpenter celebrity from the backwoods of Galilee suddenly outlasts the Roman Empire. It's, for me, a lot of ducks have to line up, and I can't reconcile how that would happen. And there's extra biblical sources that say that this is the belief and this is what they thought from back in that time. So this wasn't a legend that developed many 100 years later.
Well, it has. It's actually a story that's 5,000 years before Christ was born. The amount I've read this out when we did it. I don't know where you were on the.
Is that the Horus, the Egyptian stuff?
Yeah, well, the amount of virgin births and resurrections and miracles and that has been well told 5,000 years before Christ was even born. There's nothing original about the story whatsoever. And if you present that fact to people, no one actually goes, really? Wow, okay, that's wow, that changes everything. It's like if it was the only ever story of a resurrection and a miracle and a virgin birth, and that you'd go, okay, well, there's something unique about this. But according to history, there's no uniqueness to it at all.
There is. There's plenty of uniqueness in the gospel story, and I've seen the comparisons to Egyptian mythology, Babylonian mythology, Persian mythology, and there's many stories around the world that have similar things. A lot of those, they're not the same. It's not the same. For example, the virgin birth, there'll be differences in there. But just because there is a motif of different things does not necessarily make this wrong. Does not make it that that didn't exist.
Well, no, it doesn't. But it's really pushing the envelope, isn't it? A little bit. It wouldn't stand up very long in a court of law, that's for sure. So, Race, were you champing at the bit to say something?
Oh, no. I was quite fascinated by some of Luke's comments there, and just trying to reconcile, particularly things around, if you believe in, or if you believe in that goodness of God, then doesn't that actually go counter to what we see in events that are documented in supposedly documented in the Bible? There's war, there's pestilence, there's all of those things. So where is the good, the peaceful, that we believe in? And that's why I'm trying to reconcile those two and saying, well, that's not what I read in the Bible studies that I did as a child, So
I agree wholeheartedly. I'm glad you said it, because there are so many depictions of God in the Bible that is absolutely antithetical to this understanding that God is love, particularly with the notion that God is non-violent, because it doesn't take long to flick through the Bible and find horrifically violent acts, not just acts of people in the name of God, but acts that are directly attributed to God himself.
Yes.
And I think that's where our understanding of the Bible as this inerrant, infallible word of God that almost drops from the sky and has to be taken without contradiction throughout the whole thing.
Yep.
That falls apart very quickly because you can't believe in both. A lot of people try, but you can't. You can't say that Jesus was this peaceful, that Jesus was God and that he was peaceful and non-violent and for the least of us and inclusive and all this sort of stuff. And then also say, yeah, but he's also the same God that commanded Moses to exterminate the Canaanites because they were in their land apparently. And not only that, but do it in a way where women and children were murdered and or women were sex slaves and things like that. These horrific things. Or the one that really gets me is the flood. You know, we teach our kids this story, and we try to make it friendly by having picture books of giraffes and lions and kind of walking side by side but it's like, how are you talking about the God of love completely wiping creation and starting again and mass genocide to the greatest degree that's ever lived, apparently, and yet still be like, this was a good thing. This is a good story. God, isn't God good? Because he sent a rainbow. It's like, what? How have we glossed over this bit? And so you're right. And I wrestled with this for a very, very, very long time because I thought either I'm wrong and God isn't love, or God is loving, but he's also this, and that's how some people kind of get around it. But that doesn't line up with you know what Jesus comes to say. It's like, or we're reading these wrong. And I had to kind of readjust how I understood the Bible. And for me, particularly, look at the Old Testament, we see people's understandings of who God was based at the time. They're doing their best to try to capture what this looks like. So I see the flood story, and I see this is a story that was eventually written down sometime, but this would have been a story that had been orally transmitted for a very, very long time of an ancient Near Eastern person who clearly there was, and the evidence says there was probably a huge flood in that Mesopotamian region. Certainly not a flood over the entire world. That scientifically has never happened or been proven. But for the person who's telling that story, if there's a massive flood, the whole world is, as far as I can see, that way, and as far as I can see that way. That's the whole world. There is no such thing as China or Antarctica or, you know, it just doesn't exist. So for them, yeah, that's right. So for them, there was a flood and it flooded the whole world. And also, for them, there is no natural or supernatural. So there is no such thing as, there was this sad natural event that happened. Anything that happens is God. If it rains, it's God. If it's drought, it's God. And this is where we develop things like sacrifice and all sorts of crazy stuff to try and appease the God, to try and make stuff right. So this is a story has originated about that, right? So that's the framework that they're working in. God did this, and it was flooded the whole world. But then I look at it and I go, well, what's the beauty? How is there any beauty in this story? And then I compare it to some of the other flood stories. So the biggest one would be the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Babylonian story around that predates this story by about 2,000 years.
Wow.
And so there's nothing distinctive about that story in the Bible. But that story, the motives of the gods who sent this flood are different. It's horrific. It's because the people were too loud and they wanted to get rid of them because they were just sick of it, and all this sort of stuff. But you see throughout all of this, the actual biblical story of the flood, these little polemics against this other story. And it's likely that this story was being told around the time of the Babylonian exile, right? And being written down around that time. So they're in Babylon. They're hearing these stories of this is what happened. So this other counter story rises up that says, look, I can't argue with you that God sent a flood because we all know that's what happened. But I can argue with you on the motivations. I can argue that he's never going to do it again, that it actually wasn't him wanting to do it. It was because people were so wicked, and it wasn't like he actually loves people, and it was like, and then they frame it in a way that's recreation. It's like the same stuff that gets swallowed up in the flood is the opposite order of the Genesis story. So it's like this,
Right.
they paint this picture. It's a myth. It's a story that's carrying a truth in it that's more beautiful. But if you look at it on paper, but it's limited. It's limited to their understanding of God at that point in time. So that's how I would reconcile that. And I do that the same with all of the stuff throughout the Old Testament. I don't think that's cherry picking. It's just, I think it's a more sophisticated view of recognizing that the expectations we're placing on the Bible to be something that it actually was never created to be.
Yeah.
But there's beauty in it if we know where to look. And just because someone thought that God did this doesn't mean God did it.
No, that's, yeah.
I think,
It's story.
yeah, from my perspective, it's easy to. I mean, I think you can make anything fit if you want it to. I don't think you're disingenuous. I just think that you're happy to make it fit because you want it to be true, which is, you know, a semi-admirable trait, I think. But I just, yeah, I don't want to talk a lot about the Bible as being a part of the conversation per se, because I don't believe any of it. It was written by Iron Age peasants who used to think that it was okay to sacrifice babies by putting them under posts of their houses so that it would appease the god. This is not that long ago, Luke.
Oh, no.
Talking tens of thousands of years. These are people who were so caught up in the mystical gods that didn't exist that they would kill children and bury them under the house so that the gods were appeased and they wouldn't blow the house over. Now, those people are the ones who wrote the Bible. How can we possibly make that fit into 2023? 2024 it is now, isn't it? That's right. and logically put it all together, going, how can the writings fit in? How can I make them fit into 2024? And a lot of the stuff you've shown is that you can make it fit. It doesn't make it logical or right or even honest. And I'm not saying it's dishonest. I'm just saying that from my perspective, it comes across as fitting it in regardless of the evidence, regardless of history, regardless of all of these gods that were created. And this, it's most likely the same belief in the same non-existent God that we're trying to fit into, an ancient, totally male-dominated world in a tiny little place where Iron Age people, uneducated, knew nothing of science, medicine, anything, and this book has been put together over hundreds of years, and we're trying to make it fit and discuss it. Wow, it blows my mind. It really does.
Yeah.
I don't see us getting anywhere on this based upon the fact that we're talking about a book that I don't believe in and that you do. So I'm not sure how we reconcile that.
Well, I mean, it's even if you were to look at it as literature, you don't have to believe in something to be true to carry wisdom. There's a lot of wisdom there. There's a lot of stuff that's not wisdom.
Of course, yes.
But and I agree with you in terms of understanding around science and things like that. That's why when we look to the Bible to guide us in our understanding of science or the world around us, it's a fruitless exercise. The Catholic Church did this for many, many years. They said, well, the Bible says that the world is flat, right? Which it kind of does, because their understanding of their understanding of the earth was like a disc, a floating disc, and there was water up in the sky and there was water down below, and it was a primitive view of the thing. Galileo comes along and says, actually, I'm pretty sure the earth is round, and they killed him for it, and they sent him to
say so, yes.
Yeah, and they sent him to hell. They said he's in hell for heresy until hundreds of years later when they let him out. They did a retraction. They said, actually, he was probably right. He's not in hell.
Sorry, mate. Sorry.
We've let him out. He's in heaven now. Yeah. It's crazy because it's not a science book. That would be absurd to treat it as such. Same with the creation story. and we get scientific proof of evolution, then we go, well, that can't be true because the Bible says it's only 6,000 years. That's insane. That's not what the Bible's saying. It's a story. There's beauty in it, and I will push back on the view that it's illiterate. I mean, a lot of these stories are incredibly intricate, and have a literary genius about them that is beautiful, which you would expect as for stories that have been honed over hundreds of years in some cases, because the extraneous details get dropped, and it's really, you can get this masterful story like the Cain and Abel story, that is, there's so much in there, it's not funny, and it's beautiful, and it's compacted to like a couple of paragraphs. It's that only happens over hundreds of years of honing something. Now, you don't have to believe that two guys called Cain and Abel existed to see there's a truth within that story that can be applicable today. Like all great things, like the same with the parables that Jesus talks about. That parable of the Good Samaritan and all this sort of stuff, that's just as profound and important for people's lives today as it was back then. But it's not like all the Bible's like that. It's not all like that.
So what's so profound about the story of the Samaritan? I mean, that's just a good deed. I don't find there's a uniqueness in any of the stories. Okay, there was a good Samaritan, righto. I don't understand why that's so unique that it's like the Ten Commandments that people still choose to live by. That's where I get my morals from, the Ten Commandments. You only need one, and that's don't be a dick. And then if you do that, you're pretty well safe with everything. You don't need the Ten Commandments. They're superfluous when it comes to being a good person. Why is there such an important parable about the Good Samaritan? Why is that such a unique thing that a human being did something kind? Do you know what I mean? There's so much weight put on it.
Well, I mean, I guess it speaks to who's our enemy. Who are those that we believe that we are superior to in any way, and yet that then turns it on its head when it's actually the Samaritans, the guy that stops. It's not the priest. It's not the temple leader.
Absolutely.
It's designed. It's like all parables. They're designed to interrupt the traditional story, the traditional thought process of this is acceptable and this isn't acceptable. And look, we've heard it so many times, and we're far more, I guess, sophisticated down the track than they were at that time. But that was a pretty radical thing to say, like to even suggest that in that culture at the time was significant. And yeah, I guess for now we look at it as more of like it's a good deed, and but in that time, in that moment, it was profoundly radical and subversive and challenging to the status quo.
I guess my question is, why are we living in that era? Why are we referring back to it? Do you know what I mean? It's not like it's something that has never happened since, and it's in some way empowering or unique. It's just it's a cute story that happened a long time ago. It's a great message, relevant to the time, as you said, for someone to do that. But you could have written that. Suresh could have written that. I could have written that. It's like, why are we referencing it now in modern times? A story that was kind of, you know what I mean? Why does it keep being reborn and rehashed? I don't understand it. We don't need it.
I think for me,
good deeds and being kind and generous.
Oh, totally. And that's why if we look at the Bible as this static thing that we refer to, then we run out of options pretty quick, because it's speaking to a different people in a different time and from a different perspective that might have been applicable then. But if we start talking about how do you navigate people being bullied on social media, you're not going to find that in the Bible, because that wasn't a thing. It didn't exist. Or how do we navigate all sorts of different things, because the Bible wasn't designed to be static. For me, I look at that and I say, I see this story of Jesus. I see these accounts, and that for me reveals quite radically the actual nature of God, that God is not this violent God that is depicted throughout the Old Testament. He is loving. He is inclusive. He is non-violent. He is he's the one that's hanging out with the prostitutes and all this sort of like these people that no one else wants to. Like, he is a God for the brokenhearted and for the oppressed and the marginalized. It upends our picture of who God is. Particularly at the time, it was very challenging and radical. And so I take that and then I apply that today. Not say, well, the Bible says this, which is crazy. I say, well, the Bible shows me the character and heart of God. So then I get to looking at how the LGBTQ community is treated, and hearing Suresh talk about advocacy for same-sex marriage and things like that. And then I go, well, I can't base my understanding of this on some obscure, taken out of context verse from Paul and then one from Leviticus and some. It's like, and I won't do it now, but I could untangle those very, very quickly because they are taken out of context. But even if they weren't, I look at Jesus and I know who God is, and I can't reconcile God hating someone for being born loving someone of the same sex, right? Mm-hmm. And so I then make my decision from that, not by referring to the Bible and say, what's the biblical worldview? Because the biblical worldview of marriage isn't what we think it is anyway. There's like, so which worldview? Having multiple, like Solomon had 200 wives, it's like, or you can divorce your wife because she burnt a bit of toast and then you can go on. It's like, all of this sort of stuff is insane. This idea of biblical view of marriage doesn't exist. And if it does, you're not going to be happy with the actual biblical view that it says.
Finally, we agree on something.
Oh, 100%. But this is what I mean. I use the picture and the character, my understanding of the character of who God is as revealed to me in Jesus, to influence how I would navigate a situation like that now, rather than referring to a static text that was written thousands of years ago to say, oh, this is what I should believe on.
So what you're saying is there's nothing in the Bible whatsoever that has helped you in any way, shape or form about being a good person, about being a good, generous, loving person. You didn't need any of that stuff to know that you should be kind to LGBTQ, whatever. I was going to so many letters added to it. You didn't need that. You're already a good, kind person.
Yeah, totally.
Stand alone, brother. Stand alone. He's going to hang up on me in a minute.
No. I hear what you're saying.
Look, we do have to wrap it up. We were about 15, 20 minutes late, so that we're sort of probably getting to the point where we should. Nothing else on the screen for questions? Any other quick remarks from anyone before we disappear?
There's another one, Softs G.
Sorry?
Someone else, Softs G. Let's see if there is in there. Softs G, I think, is Muslim. It says Allah informs us all of the answers in the Quran. 3 questions. How can you pass this test of life if you don't even know your purpose? Geography doesn't affect truth. There's only one truth. We innately know what is right and wrong. If someone chooses to follow their parents over truth, they make that choice. So I guess there's a critique there from Softs G about the geography argument.
I mean, it's saying there's only one truth. That is just absolutely shutting everyone out, which is the whole point about the argument about the geography. The geography, and saying that, well, Christianity is the only truth and to bugger everyone else. So who was that from?
Softs G.
Soft G.
No, yeah, Soft G.
We must get people to tell us where they're from, what country or whatever, because that would be fascinating to know where these questions are coming in from. But
I'll be able to see in the stats. A few more comments from Fenton. Talking about what I was saying earlier with the Gilgamesh epic and
wow.
So there's some more just comments there, but no other questions. But it's really good to have some interaction. There's no right or wrong comments, or everyone's in a different space, but we appreciate the interaction, that's for sure.
Yeah, no one's been nasty, which is kind of nice. So all of the people who did comment or make questions tonight, please do so. And next week we'll try and hone in a bit more. And because of my constant Facebook request is to get you involved and have people asking the questions, so we don't just get too internalized. We want to broaden what it is we're talking about, driven by you, the people on YouTube. So please continue to do that. We'll concentrate a little bit more on next Wednesday, which will be the 17th, of course, of January 2024. Thank you, gentlemen. Fascinating, as always. I think Rich might be back next week. We'll see how we can squeeze you in somewhere. Suresh might end up down to a 4-person one, but we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Not a worry.
That'd be good. That'd be good.
That'd be
Fantastic.
great.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Take care. We'll catch you next week as we do another episode podcast. An atheist, a believer, and a pastor walk into a bar. I'm yet to find out what happens after that, but maybe we need to go to a bar and see what happens.
Yeah.